I'd like to welcome everybody for this Masterclass series that we are organizing with the support of Oxfam. The team of Business Call to Action is very glad to have you all here with us, particularly to talk to a very sensitive and a very interesting thematic area that we are now emphasizing our problematic things that we are working inside of Business Call to Action. So I'd like to thank Theo for this support and all the Oxfam team for going through this process with us in presenting this masterclass with you. So I'm Luciana Aguiar, I'm the manager of Business Call to Action. Business Call to Action is a global inclusive business platform that is focused mainly in identifying best practices of businesses that are tackling poverty and engaging with the low-income communities in many different ways. This is quite a unique multilateral initiative that is supported by the Swiss, Swedish, UK, and Dutch governments together with UNDP. So BCTA is a platform that hosts 250 member companies that are operating in 72 countries. And they have committed to have a very positive impact in around 300 million people. So BCTA members are companies that are operating in very different sectors, and they also have present very different sizes. What calls our attention mainly in this set of very well selected companies is the fact that they are operating in very challenging markets. And they are, in fact, delivering services. They are engaging with the low-income population in many different ways, be it as business partners, employees, or customers and clients. So the reason why we are here mainly, and we are looking particularly in terms of developing this masterclass on gender equality, is the fact that inclusive business models engage in many different ways with women from the low-income segments. And women economic empowerment is quite critical to achieve, particularly when we look at the business lens. We understand that women are very key contributors to economies as producers of food, managers of natural resources, entrepreneurs, and employees. In fact, are the main producers of unpaid care and domestic work, and we need to actually to have a more comprehensive program in order to address the structural barriers and gender discriminatory practices that deny women their economic rights and also restrict their economic and social opportunities. So we hope that we can inspire your initiatives to develop jobs and livelihoods opportunities for women, also to help to reform discriminatory labor policies and attitudes, and actually establish a more gender inclusive workplace where women and men have equal opportunities to contribute, benefit, and advance their careers. So thank you. Theo, over to you. I'm sure that you're going to present very interesting things that Oxfam has developed for us.
Fantastic, great, thanks Luciana. And welcome everyone to our webinar on gender equality. The webinar is going to be an overview of the main challenges and opportunities within your workforce around gender equality and why it matters for your operation and your value chain. My name, as you can see, is Phil Walsh. I'll be hosting today. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. So we're going to pose you a few questions as we go through to get your opinions. I'll be running a poll as well. So we'll be using a few bits of the functionality in Zoom to engage you throughout the webinar. We also have to let you know this webinar is being recorded. So if you like it, you can share it afterwards. Once it goes live, it will be hosted on the Business Call to Action website. And also, if you like it, we have a second webinar coming up on Thursday, which will cover specifically low-income women in supply chains. So that's one for your diary. It'll be the same time on Thursday. COVID-19 and government's measures in response to the pandemic have really made visible how critical women workers are to many business and operations and supply chains, and how women's voices and needs and priorities are too often overlooked. This discussion is fundamentally about how businesses can identify value and address women's priorities, needs and voices. But it's more than that. It's actually, if you think about it, it's really about human rights. So we wanted to give you a little bit of background on Oxfam. So we're a global organisation. We're working in over 90 countries across the world. We work in partnerships with governments, with civil society organisations, and of course with businesses. Oxfam has a vision for engaging companies to reduce poverty, supporting empowerment of women and tackling inequality whilst upholding human rights. So today's webinar isn't really just from an NGO perspective. We are leaning heavily on the work we've done with companies, you know, names like Unilever, Burberry, Marks and Spencer's, just to name a few. But what we're aiming to do here is not take the traditional approach of looking at these issues as social or development issues. We're really looking at showing it how they're business issues and they're critical economic issues for every business and organisation around the world. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Kate Cooper. Kate is an economist with over 10 years experience of working with DFID and on private sector engagement in women's economic empowerment. She joined Oxfam last year as a private sector and gender advisor at Oxfam. Lena has 10 years experience of working on value chain and private sector development and is an Oxfam global advisor on women's economic empowerment. So we've got 4 topics that we're going to cover. You're going to see this slide a few times. This is our agenda slide, and we're going to come back to this a few times to help guide you through the presentation. Essentially, we're starting with a bit of an introduction around gender equality and why it matters, to make sure we're all speaking the same language and we're all on the same page around what we're talking about. The next 2 topics around unpaid care and domestic work and safety in and out of work are really about addressing the underlying challenges, the underlying factors behind gender equality and gender inequality. And then finally, we're thinking about the opportunities of what you can do. We're thinking about going beyond audit, and we'll be talking about that in our final session. So that's a bit from us on kind of what we're going to talk about. Now I'm going to pass over to you because I'd like you to answer this brief poll, which should be appearing on your screens in front of you. So the question is, how would you rate your organisation's approach to gender equality in operations and supply chains? And it's completely anonymous, so you don't need to worry about answering it. But it would be great. I can see some answers flying in. Progressive but room for improvement is the outstanding leader at the moment. A few people self-recognising as superstars, which is great to see. And similarly great to see that people are nominating that they can see that they've got a long way to go. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. It'd be great to get everyone's response in. We're about 56% right now. I wonder if I can encourage a few more of you to reach onto the keyboard and select one of the options. Okay, we got a couple more in. We've got a couple more in. So I'm going to end the polling and show the results here. So as you can see, as I mentioned right from the start, way out in front with 18 of our participants are selecting progressive but room for improvement, which is great to see that we've got a progressive audience here and we're looking for more that we can do. So thank you very much for that. So after that, I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to talk about gender equality and why it matters.
Thanks, Phil. So I think it's really important to note that we're not even close to achieving gender equality. The statistic you can see now is from the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Gender Gap Report. At the current rate, it will take another 100 years to close the overall gender gap and 257 years to bring about parity in the workplace. Progress has stalled. The workplace parity statistic has actually gotten worse. In the 2019 report, this number was 202 years. And this isn't the only news on the status of gender equality. Women are paid 23% less than men globally. 600 million women are in the most insecure and precarious forms of work. Globally, the percentage of women MPs is 24.5%, which means women's voices are absent from key political decision-making spaces. We have seen in the news that women's workloads as unpaid carers and paid care workers have been excessive, that women's jobs are more precarious than men's at a time when women are held responsible for putting food on the table, caring, and keeping the family healthy, often at risk to themselves. We have seen the United Nations announcements about increases in violence against women in homes, streets, and the workplace. Violence and heavy unequal care workloads were a major issue last year too. We need a step change in approach to go further and faster in addressing gender equality. Many companies have expressed their commitment to fast track progress on this too. So in 2015, the UN set the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a set of 17 global goals for international development. The capacity of innovation to break global development trends is recognized in these SDGs. Each acknowledges the importance of actionable strategies to leverage innovative practices in science, technology, and entrepreneurship. The fifth of these SDGs is gender equality. And the UN says, gender equality is a fundamental human right. Yet despite progress, women and girls around the world do not fully experience equal rights, and their potential as economic, social, and sustainable development change agents remains untapped. Companies that focus on women's empowerment experience greater business success. Research shows investing in women and girls can lead to increases in productivity, organizational effectiveness, returns on investment, and higher consumer satisfaction. One estimate indicates that reaching SDG 5 on gender equality could contribute up to $28 trillion to global GDP by 2025. The SDG on gender equality includes targets on ending all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere, eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls, recognizing and valuing unpaid care and domestic work, and ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. So in addition, there are regulatory reasons for companies to prioritize gender equality. 189 countries have signed and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is an international treaty adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly, or there's the Modern Slavery Act, which was introduced by the UK government in 2015. The majority of people experiencing modern slavery are women. So what can companies do? The UN have developed the Women's Empowerment Principles, which we at Oxfam use in our Behind the Barcodes campaign. These principles outline actions in operations and supply chains which facilitate women's empowerment and has been endorsed by over 2,700 businesses. The UN also hosted a high-level panel for women's economic empowerment in 2016, with representatives from businesses such as IKEA and City Research, alongside representatives from government and academia. The high-level panel identified 7 drivers to women's economic empowerment, and we'll be covering these in the webinar on Thursday. So it's not enough to focus only on equal pay policies and creating more jobs for women. If we want real change, we have to look at the key underlying factors of inequality. I'm going to hand over to Lena to talk about this now.
Thanks very much, Kate. So the second women's empowerment principle is about treating women and men fairly at work. But in order to enable this, we have to look beyond the immediate workplace practices to these underlying inequality factors, which Kate has just mentioned, which they often impact people's capacity to fully participate in the workplace. So the first underlying factor which we want to look at is unpaid care and domestic work. So firstly, what do we mean by unpaid care and domestic work? Well, essentially, it comprises of 2 things. The first is the direct care of people, which includes things such as childcare, feeding, dressing, emotional support, caring for elderly parents, etc. And the second is domestic work, which includes activities both inside and outside the house. And this includes cooking the food, food shopping, fetching water, etc. Now, care work underpins the economy and it's essential to the functioning of society. Unpaid care produces goods such as meals and also services such as clean clothes. It's very much work. And at Oxfam, we've estimated that it contributes $10.8 trillion a year to the global economy. And yet, despite all of this work is taken for granted. It's invisible in policy making, it's undervalued and underinvested in by governments, businesses, and communities. Now, in all societies and economies, care is provided by 4 sets of actors, which we can see here. So we have households, the state, civil society, and the market or the private sector. And what the evidence shows us is that care responsibilities currently sit overwhelmingly at the household level, particularly poor households, and within that, predominantly with women. Now, the framework shows us not only who has responsibility for providing care, but also how this can change. So we're actually going to look at an example of what that change can look like using COVID-19. And we would like you to take a moment to consider the different ways in which COVID-19 may have affected the distribution of care responsibilities across these 4 actors from what you have seen. So please feel free to type your answers into the chat box, and Phil is going to monitor the chat box for your answers.
Great, thank you, Lena. I'm just reiterating the question in the chat box now. How has COVID-19 affected these 4 actors? So answers in the chat box, please. I'll give you a couple of minutes to put some answers in. So we've got our first answering. Social distancing at the marketplace has been a big impact. Unequal distribution of chores in the family. Yep. Loss of incomes, overarching state. The civil society organisations are unable to implement their core mandate. That's a great few answers. Thank you. And also noticing that in India, civil society has taken more responsibility. Fantastic. Lena, there's a couple more coming in. So massive impact on all 4 elements in South Africa with national lockdown that's been going for over 6 weeks, huge economic losses and lack of support for those without means, for those that are unemployed, and women who are sole breadwinners losing income due to social distancing in markets. Many people have lost their jobs and income, and the clear answer summed up by Pritha Lovely, that's women facing more of the brunt.
Great, thank you very much everyone for your answers, really useful to hear. And one of the things that we can see is definitely how a crisis impacts the capacity of these different actors to be able to cover care and domestic work responsibilities. And definitely one common thread through that we have seen at Oxfam is how much work is shifting back onto the household as a result of reduced services being provided by governments and businesses. So if we think back to pre-COVID-19, the state would be providing free schooling for all children up to a certain age. Businesses might have been offering flexible working arrangements so that parents could pick their children up from school, and civil society or charities may have been putting on after-school activities. Now, the impact of the virus has meant a closure of schools across many countries, restrictions in the number of people attending meetings, which in turn has meant that after-school activities can't take place. And this impact has very much had to be absorbed by households, with women taking on a disproportionate amount of this responsibility. And it's further been emphasised with the impact of furlough or similar kind of job retention schemes, where anecdotal evidence is showing us that women are more likely to furlough or be encouraged to furlough because there's an expectation of an increase in their unpaid care responsibility that they will take on. Now, while the pandemic is exacerbating the unpaid and often invisible work which is largely provided by women, it is also highlighting that if we want to live in a sustainable and resilient society or economy, we have to consider care as a priority investment for all key actors. Now, in addition to the wider social and economic benefits which we've mentioned, Oxfam's research has shown that businesses can derive several direct benefits themselves by supporting the delivery of unpaid care and domestic work. And Oxfam worked in conjunction with Unilever to develop a business briefing, which can be seen here, which includes details of these benefits, and we're going to go through some of them now. So the first way in which companies can benefit is around talent acquisition. So businesses which have policies in place that support family and household care, these policies can include things such as parental leave or flexible work arrangements, find it easier to both attract and retain workers. So 77% of workers say that paid family leave could actually sway their choice of employer. Now, the second reason why companies should consider unpaid care and domestic work is around productivity and employee engagement. So employers that take a holistic view of workers' lives and that support workers in managing their care and household responsibilities can actually help to address aspects which can cause employee distraction, fatigue, and absenteeism. And this in turn can help improve workforce performance and engagement. So in a study of more than 1,500 employers, 70% of those who offered improved leave policies actually reported an increase in worker productivity. Now, the next way in which companies can benefit from supporting unpaid care is around building supply chain resilience and diversity. So businesses which encourage their own suppliers to address unpaid care and work issues can help build stable and diverse sources of supply. And here we have an example from Martor, which is a car component manufacturer in Turkey. And they were actually able to reduce staff turnover by 15% just by offering childcare related benefits. Next, we're looking at revenue and business growth. Now, consumers and workers are already taking on non-traditional roles, but company communications to employees, as well as advertising, often assumes and reinforces stereotypical roles. So Oxfam worked with Harrison's, which is an ad agency, to co-create an advert. And this was based on Oxfam's research on social norms in the Philippines, which showed that men not only wanted better relationships with their children, but also with their partners. Now we're going to take a couple of minutes to watch this video, which I think is a really great example of positive advertising. So we're going to invite you to watch the video now, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to watch the advert now.
Buti pa sila, meron panlambingan. Buti pa sila, meron pang kilig. Siguro dapat ibalik natin yung dati. Siguro, dapat ligawan kita ulit. Dapat ibalik natin yung lambingan. Ibalik natin yung kilig.
I love you.
Ang pagkukusa sa gawaing bahay ay pagmamahal sa iyong may bahay. Because care work is teamwork.
So this advert shows that developing goods and services to address unpaid care and domestic work can actually be a way for you as a business to differentiate your brand. This particular advert was seen by over 34 million people, and it was taken up by traditional media. It was shown in airports, it was shown to youth groups, amongst other mechanisms. Another example of developing products which address unpaid care and domestic work is HDFC's Standard Life Smart Women insurance products. And this was specifically targeted at women to help cope with the disruption caused by unpaid care responsibilities. And this award-winning policy was sold more than 4,000 times in just the first month. Now, the last point we'd like to highlight is on customer acquisition and loyalty. So businesses which differentiate their brand through challenging the dynamics which underpin unpaid care work can actually win new customer loyalty. 39% of consumers have said that they believe advertising does not accurately represent all genders, and 30% actually felt that brands misrepresented them and their gender. Now, within the business briefing, we identified 6 steps which can support companies to think through what you can do on unpaid care and domestic work. And we'd like to take a moment here to reflect on examples which you may have. So I'm going to hand over to Phil to facilitate the next moment.
So the question I'm putting in the chat box for you right now, as Lena has said, is what examples of good practice can you share? And either at your organisation or an organisation you've been working with or an organisation you heard of, and can you allocate a number to it as per the slide to show us which type of action it was? So you can, the question's in there now, and the idea is that you'll give us an example of good practice that you have seen or have heard about or have participated in, and you'll look at those 6 categories on the slide and say, oh, that was a number for an identify type of action. And as they come in, we'll do a little summary of what we get. So one example shared here is that we've developed a guide for corporate sector in Ukraine for how to promote GE and domestic violence prevention policies. Nice. I wonder which number, that's from Natalia. I wonder which number you would allocate to that, Natalia. Number 6, thank you very much. And Kate's got an example of engaging employees on the design of shared parental leave as a number 5. Another number 5 from Sheila's coming in, regular anonymous survey to staff to understand their work-life balance, realities, and where they could use more support. That's lovely.
Excellent. So we've had, a few answers come in there. Please do keep them coming in. Really great to see those examples. We've got another one here with COVID-19 and the lockdown impact. We're re-looking at our policies. Number 2, so working from home is something we're actively putting in place, and we're also taking the employee viewpoint and designing the policies around it. Excellent. So yeah, really engaging with employee voice there, and also being forced to look at kind of flexible working arrangements because of the crisis, and another one around anonymous surveys. Excellent. So thank you for those inputs. It's really insightful, and I think it's clear that there are a number of businesses who are already thinking of innovative ways to recognise and redistribute unpaid care and domestic work responsibilities, I think particularly at this moment in time. And I do think it's something which is going to become more of a priority in the future. And companies which are already being proactive on this issue are going to be ahead of the curve. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now for our next section.
Great, thank you, Lena. So the third women's empowerment principle is about ensuring health, safety and well-being of all women and men at work. This speaks to the significance of tackling gender-based violence for business. We know the statistics on violence against women and girls are shocking. 1 in 3 female garment factory workers have experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months. This is a trend we see more broadly. 35% of women have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. And this figure doesn't include sexual harassment. We know gender-based violence in and out of work is a problem, but what actually is it? So gender is defined by society, and it dictates how men and women are expected to behave. For example, it means we have expectations about what is women's work and what is men's work. We define gender-based violence as when power is used to reinforce expectations of gendered social norms. For example, in some factories, there's an expectation that supervisors need to shout and behave aggressively. In some cases, this results in physical or verbal abuse against women who work for them. Gender-based violence can be physical violence, it can be sexual violence, or it can be psychological violence. If supervisors are setting the norms in terms of behaviours in a factory, then other men may feel able to treat their female co-workers in the same way. There are a huge number of reports of women experiencing verbal abuse and harassment, sexual jokes, and physical abuse at the workplace. One last point, it's really important to remember that gender-based violence can be used against men as well as women. So we put these statistics up to give context to the extent of the problem. We've drawn these from the World Economic Forum, from Care Australia and the Overseas Development Institute. These statistics demonstrate that gender-based violence is a global problem, and it's not just a case of individual acts of violence, but rather a systemic problem rooted in gender discrimination and inequality. Gender-based violence has a high cost to society in terms of devastating psychological impacts on victims and survivors. It also has a high cost to the economy, with estimates of these costs totaling $1.5 trillion. This is equivalent to 2% of global GDP. The UN have been considering gender-based violence in the context of country responses to the coronavirus pandemic. The lockdown in Albania is already creating fertile ground for gender-based violence and gender inequalities to be exposed. Women are reporting instances of violence as they have to remain in isolation with the perpetrators of this violence. Being aware of the extent of the danger victims of gender-based violence face when being forced to live with the perpetrators, UNDP rang the alarm bell and appealed to partners at a local level to consider the special needs of women and girls in addressing COVID-19 related emergencies. It's important to flag that there is no one single cause of violence against women and girls. What you're looking at now has been taken from the Oxfam's Say Enough to Violence campaign. Gender-based violence is normalised and tolerated from the individual level all the way up to global levels. It's reinforced by stereotypes and social norms and by media representations of gender. At an individual level, attitudes and beliefs are used to justify unequal gender roles. Family and relationships reinforce the expectations of men as decision makers in the household and enable controlling behaviours. The community also upholds these norms and adds the norm of blaming and shaming survivors, creating a belief that it's a survivor's fault for transgressing these norms and causing someone to escalate the reinforcement of them through the use of violence. Societally and globally, norms are reinforced by regressive legislation, media actions, and a set of rules which emphasize men's power over women. As a company, you need to think about the multiple ways in which norms are reinforced when thinking about how to challenge within your operations and supply chains. We have a real challenge in understanding the scale of the problem. The UN have found that only 107 of 195 countries have data available on intimate partner violence, a number that falls to just 56 countries when we seek to understand non-intimate partner violence. Even when data is available, it's likely that these figures are underestimates, as it's notoriously difficult to collect sensitive information on violence against women, as survivors may fear coming forward or feel ashamed. Businesses are often seen as economic agents, and we want to make it clear that ignoring these issues is economically bad for companies. This isn't just a moral issue, but one which is bad for business. The cost to business of safety issues in and out of work can be thought of using this model of direct and indirect costs. This framework is from a report from the Overseas Development Institute called Costing the Impacts of Gender-Based Violence to Businesses, a Practical Toolkit. So here you can see direct costs to companies include total cost of staff time lost due to reduced productivity or absenteeism, the cost of service provision, and support to access other services. Indirect costs to companies include additional hours for managers and staff dealing with absenteeism, and cost of staff turnover and recruitment, and any subsequent training costs. So what can businesses do? We've split these examples along operations and supply chains. So taking operations first, we've used an example from the Vodafone Foundation, who have developed a domestic violence toolkit to help support employees who are experiencing domestic violence. This toolkit makes a business case for companies to support employees who may be experiencing violence, stating companies have an important role to play in helping to prevent domestic violence and abuse, where its impacts on the workplace and where a victim's work, productivity, and safety are affected. In tackling domestic violence, companies have improved reputations, enabling them to attract and retain workers. Victims are able to spend more time on their work instead of dealing with anxiety and fear or struggling to deal with the consequences of violence and abuse. Productivity improves when those committing violence and abuse concentrate on their work rather than on perpetrating violence. Employees will be more productive and happier if they're able to talk to someone they trust and find a solution to their safety at work. And there's a positive impact on the wider community as family relationships of, if violence and abuse is identified and then prevented. So the toolkit that they use is a framework of recognize, respond, and refer. So that's recognize the problem, break the silence, and raise awareness. Respond to the issue, ensuring policies and procedures are in place and can respond appropriately and empathetically when employees disclose, and that staff are trained in this. And refer employees to appropriate internal confidential resources. While this is targeting domestic violence specifically, the approach raises the profile of unacceptable behaviour in and out of work and gives workers confidence that these issues will be treated appropriately. Challenging these social norms and supporting employees in this way is a really constructive way to promote safety in and out of work. Now let's think about supply chains. Using our experience working with companies in partnership, we've developed some recommendations we can all build into our supply chains. These include long-term partnerships with suppliers, treating them as a partner and having inquisitive conversations. This means being proactive, not reactive. Implementing innovative policies and practices, or including such things as part of your supplier code of conduct, like grievance mechanisms or training for staff in supply chains on their rights. Consider worker voice and think about worker representation. Not just traditional ways of worker voice being heard, but also how to engage with local partners, including women's rights organisations. Consider alliances across the sector and joint advocacy. Undertake bespoke research. So this could be social norms diagnostics, risk mapping to identify potential hotspots for gender-based violence, or undertaking an organisational health check. Be transparent. This helps build a culture of trust. And lastly, don't forget about the men. We need to think of men as part of this holistic solution. I'm now going to hand over to Lena for the last topic.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. Really important topic there. Now we're going to talk about our last topic for today, which is about how businesses can really identify gender equality issues and what are the mechanisms that exist for doing this apart from audits. Now, firstly, what are the limitations of audits, especially when it comes to issues linked to gender, although actually these limitations are likely to be relevant for all marginalised groups. So firstly, the evidence shows us that very few non-compliances which are reported during an audit process actually relate to gender. It's about 1% or so. And the vast majority of non-compliances or issues relate to health and safety issues. And this is because gender equality itself is a really complex subject, and it means looking at things such as power, leadership, violence, and these issues are not things which can easily be identified through simple questionnaires. Another reason is that gender inequalities are embedded into culture quite often, which means that people don't report them, either because they don't think anything wrong has occurred, and we sometimes see this with instances of sexual harassment, or because of implicit power imbalances. There's also a general lack of trust. Workers may be unlikely to trust in auditors who are often only present on site for one day a year. Workers might be worried about retaliation, and therefore they don't want to risk raising an issue. And then there's the question of, well, if they do raise an issue, how likely is it that anything's going to be done about it? Will it actually get resolved? And so the problem is that if we're not diagnosing gender problems through audit, and they're our main tool for identifying gender issues, then that means we can't move on to identifying and implementing appropriate solutions. So we have to look at alternative mechanisms. And I know that we'll have a number of companies participating in the webinar today who are already going to be implementing some of these. So I'm going to hand you over to Phil, who's going to ask you to feed in some of your examples.
So folks, it's time for another chat box moment. So get your fingers ready. As Lena has said, the question for the chat box is simply this. In your imagination, from your point of view, what are the alternatives to audit? We've talked about the limitations there. So I'd be really interested, we'd be really interested to hear the alternative suggestions that you have. Okay, so great answer coming in straight away. I appreciate the speed. Anonymous calls. Wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you. And I'm sure there'll be people typing away their answers as we speak. They'll be ready to pop up in the chat box any second. So self-assessment, that's a great idea. Yeah, and that's echoed because that's coming in twice. Surveys, focus groups, critical to capture stakeholder voice. Lovely. Surveys and stories, that's a really nice different angle. So talking about sharing stories, that's really good. Team building activities, women's empowerment trainings, other forms of certification that look into how employees are treated, and in particular women. Team activities and team building, that's a really strong thread that's coming through. So Lena, perhaps you could comment on those, and I'm handing back over to you.
Loads of fantastic examples there. Thank you, everyone. So there is a lot of emphasis on being able to surface problems by enabling effective worker voice. So we heard that within kind of focus groups, surveys, critical to capture stakeholder voice. And this is really important. And for women, that often means creating separate safe spaces where they feel they can trust that they can raise issues, and there aren't kind of implicit power balances in place there. And this really does help to flag risks in the workplace. So we have a few examples which we've put on the slide. They're not in any particular order. So we've looked at worker voice, We've got human rights due diligence assessments there, and we would look at putting a strong gender lens on these human rights risk assessments. And the great thing about these assessments is that this approach not only helps to flag risks in the immediate workplace, but also looks at the sector as a whole, so it can help companies who are working in the sector know what to look for. We've got building partnerships with suppliers, which is really important. So building kind of trust with your suppliers and ensuring your suppliers know that if there is a problem, that you as clients or buyers are committed to solving it or to addressing the issue collaboratively and are not just going to walk away. And to do this, all parties along the supply chain really need to be bought into the premise of gender equality and not just see it as a box ticking exercise. We also have including buying and sourcing teams. Now, often gender equality is seen as the remit of the CSR department, but it's actually something which everyone in the business has to take responsibility for. So as we've talked about, it's a business and an economic issue, and so we have to be integrating human rights, gender rights, labour rights directly into processes such as sourcing strategies, procurement processes, contracting, and really encouraging an integrated approach across the business. And it's particularly important to include buying and sourcing teams within the human rights due diligence assessments, as these are the teams which are often best positioned to spot issues. And lastly, we have collaboration with civil society organisations, and these include trade unions and women's rights organisations who can complement your knowledge as a business in the existing area, and who also often have local knowledge as well, so they can help in finding bespoke solutions which work for your company and supply chain. Now, we wanted to show some examples of work which we've done with companies, which we think really encapsulates going beyond audit. So the first example is from S Group, which is a large supermarket chain in Sweden. And we worked with them to firstly identify which supply chains were potentially a high risk. Then we conducted a human rights risk assessment, and out of this came a number of recommendations which could be applied to other aspects of the supply chain. And this formed part of a pilot work which was done with the S Group to going beyond audit. In this case, we looked at the tomato supply chain in Italy, which is known for having a number of human rights risks. We conducted a piece of in-depth research and then published a report with the recommendations which S Group have used to inform their actions going forward. In the second example, we worked in partnership with Unilever to understand and improve conditions in the Vietnam supply chain. And we conducted again on-the-ground research with factories in Vietnam, made a series of recommendations to Unilever on a range of different issues, which included gender equality. And again, this report was published, as was a follow-up report when we visited the factory 4 years later. And publishing the report showed a significant amount of transparency and accountability on these human rights issues. And finally, we were invited alongside a trade union to develop a new responsible sourcing strategy for Tesco, which is a leading supermarket in the UK. And as a consequence of this engagement, Tesco put more emphasis on worker representation and gender equality in their business model. And these commitments have helped them to achieve the top position in the scorecard, which features in Oxfam's Behind the Barcodes campaign, which ranks supermarkets on their human rights practices. So I'm going to hand you back over to Phil.
Yeah, and it's just a really quick one to say from me that when the webinar finishes, we're going to stop the recording and we're going to allow people to stay on for a live Q&A. So we'll have 10 minutes or so. So if people are interested in asking questions, then we'll stop the recording and we'll have questions for Lena and Kate and the folks at BTCA at the end of the webinar. Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks. So what are the key things we want you to take away from today? So the first is that gender equality is important. Addressing it isn't just the right thing to do, there's also a strong business case for doing so as well. There are a number of key challenges women face in operations and supply chains, some of which we've talked about today, although there are others. Companies can support women in operations and supply chains to balance their paid work with their unpaid care and domestic work responsibilities, and make gains in productivity, absenteeism, and turnover if they do so. Similarly, businesses benefit from considering safety in and out of work in operations and supply chains. And finally, companies are better positioned to address the challenges to improving gender equality by going beyond audit, and are better able to identify and address gendered issues in operations and supply chains. So I'm going to hand over to Phil for our last slide.
Okay, so finally, the slide's saying it for me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending the time learning about such an important issue to all of us on the call. The webinar will be available on video and recording, so you'll be able to share it. It's going to be hosted on the Business Call to Action website when it's ready. So look out for that and share it with other people in your networks who'll be interested. Similarly, we have a second webinar coming on Thursday, which specifically looks at women in low-income roles in supply chain. If you have any detailed questions or like to understand more, there's details on the screen now for Luciana from Business Call to Action at UNDP, and there's also Kate's details from Oxfam. So if you have questions, please do get in touch. As I said, we will be staying online. So if you'd like to have some open questions, then that would be wonderful. One thing I'm going to ask before I hand back to Rabil at Business Call to Action for a closing statement, one thing I'm going to ask is, as you've listened to the webinar today, before you leave, and if you're going to drop off now, that's absolutely fine, but before you leave, if you could write in the chat box one thing that you might be doing differently or exploring, or one new understanding, one thing in the chat box that you're taking away from today's webinar, that would be great. And Rabil, with that, I'm going to hand over to you for final comments.
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil. It's been such an insightful masterclass. And I mean, it is clear that gender equality in the workplace is of paramount importance, in particular for inclusive businesses that are leading the global sustainable development agenda. And there are steps that we can take within our workplaces to tackle unpaid care work, gender-based violence, and how we can learn more from going beyond the audit. So the concern is that the pandemic may have derailed or even pushed back on the gains made in the recent years, which is why we are bringing this now at this time through these masterclasses, hoping to open this dialogue up with the businesses that we work with to explore how we can push the envelope at the individual level, at the marketplace, and at the ecosystem level. So I'm very excited about the second masterclass in this series, which is taking place on Thursday this week. The topic there is addressing low-income women in the business value chains, and I'm hoping that you will all tune in then too. Thank you so much.